The evening air was bitter, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you wish for the warmth of a blanket. Outside a sleek high-rise office building, Mark stood at his post, dressed in his security guard uniform, his breath visible in the frigid air. The building was quiet, save for the occasional footsteps of workers leaving their late shifts. His job was simple: keep the building secure and ensure only authorized people entered. But tonight, something was different. Mark's gaze fell on a homeless man loitering by the entrance, shivering beneath a threadbare coat. The man's face was hidden beneath a hood, but Mark could make out his gaunt features, his tired eyes, and the faint tremble in his hands. He knew the type: another beggar, looking for a handout or trouble. The man didn't belong in this part of the city, surrounded by the polished, expensive buildings. Mark's unease grew as the man lingered by the entrance, looking lost and out of place. He didn't want any trouble. The streets could be a harsh place for someone like him, but Mark's patience was thin tonight. The cold had a way of making people irritable. Mark stepped forward, his boots crunching on the cold pavement as he made his way toward the homeless man. His patience had worn thin. "Hey," Mark's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the night. "You can't hang around here. Move along." The homeless man, who had been hunched over, slowly straightened up. His eyes met Mark's, soft and weary. "I'm not causing any trouble," the man replied, his voice calm and gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness of Mark's tone. "I'm just resting for a bit. I'll be gone soon." Mark's irritation flared. He wasn't in the mood for polite excuses. "I said move." "Now," he ordered, his voice growing more forceful. The man's eyes seemed to hold something deeper, but Mark didn't care. He grabbed the man by the arm, pulling him away from the entrance. The homeless man didn't fight back. He simply let himself be guided, his face a mask of resignation. As Mark dragged him towards the street, a few people passing by glanced over but quickly turned away, as if this was just another routine event, a homeless person being shoved aside, as they often were in this part of town. Before Thomas turned to leave, he stopped and gave Mark a strange look, one that lingered in his eyes. It was as if he knew something Mark didn't. There was a flicker of recognition, something almost familiar about the way the homeless man looked at him. But before Mark could make sense of it, Thomas gave a small nod and shuffled away, disappearing into the cold night. Mark stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy, but quickly shrugged it off. It was just another job. As Mark resumed his shift, the unease continued to nag at him, settling in his chest like a heavy weight. He tried to focus on the quiet rhythm of the night, the distant hum of city traffic, but his mind kept drifting back to the homeless man. Something about his eyes, the way Thomas had looked at him, was unsettling. It wasn't just the gaze of a person beaten down by life. It was as if those eyes held a hidden truth, something Mark couldn't quite place. The night dragged on, but the feeling wouldn't go away. During a quiet moment, Mark decided to take a break and sat in front of the security monitors, flicking through the footage of the building's entrance. He watched as Thomas had stood there, looking lost, before he was forcibly removed. Mark paused the video and zoomed in on the homeless man's face. It hit him like a punch to the gut. The man's features, the shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, the way his eyes seemed too familiar, reminded him of someone from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years. He stared at the screen, a chill creeping up his spine. Could it really be? The thought seemed absurd, but the more he looked, the more certain he became. That man, it couldn't be, but the resemblance was uncanny. Mark's heart raced. What had he done? The sound of a luxury car pulling up outside the building snapped Mark out of his thoughts. He looked up and saw a sleek black sedan glide to a stop by the curb. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit stepped out, his face tight with anxiety. The man glanced around, scanning the area as if searching for something or someone. Mark straightened up, noticing the man's urgency. He recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Reynolds, the CEO of the company housed in the building.
Hey,
"Excuse me," Mr. Reynolds called out, approaching Mark with an unsettling look on his face. "Have you seen a homeless man around here? He's about my height, ragged clothes, looks like he's been through hell." Mark frowned, confusion creeping over him. Yeah, I saw him. I kicked him out earlier. He was hanging around the entrance, and I told him to leave." "Mr. Reynolds's expression changed instantly. Shock, then horror washed over him. His face paled as he took a step closer. "Where did he go? Did he leave the area? Please, tell me where he is." His voice trembled with urgency, a far cry from the usual calm and composed CEO Mark was used to seeing. Mark's mind raced. "Why are you so concerned?" he asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Mr. Reynolds seemed to hesitate for a moment, then his eyes softened with a deep sadness. "Because that man is my brother Thomas, my brother who disappeared years ago. I've been searching for him ever since. I thought he was dead. I never imagined he would be here. Like this." Mark froze. The realization hit him like a wave. The homeless man he had kicked out, Thomas, was the CEO's brother. "Mr. Reynolds's face crumpled as he spoke, the weight of the years catching up with him. "Thomas? He wasn't always like this," he began, his voice soft but filled with pain. "He was once a brilliant businessman. He was part of the Reynolds family empire, one of the brightest minds we had. Our parents were so proud of him." Mark listened intently, barely able to process the words. The man he had just kicked out was someone's brother. Yes. But this was a tragedy Mark never could have imagined. "After our parents passed away," Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice breaking slightly, he changed. He fell into a deep depression. He couldn't handle losing them. It was like his entire world collapsed in an instant. The company, the family, it all became too much for him. Mark shifted uneasily, the guilt building in his chest. He had dismissed the homeless man so easily, not knowing the history behind his worn-out face. Mr. Reynolds' words cut through him like a knife. Thomas left everything behind. He just disappeared one day. No notes, no warnings. He left the company, left us all wondering what happened to him. Mr. Reynolds paused, staring at the ground for a long moment. "We tried to find him. We searched everywhere, investigators, private detectives, even social services, but there was no trace. The family thought he was dead, or maybe living somewhere far away. But no one ever expected to find him like this, not on the streets." Mark felt a deep, gnawing guilt surge within him. He had judged Thomas based on his appearance, throwing him out like a nuisance. The man had once been a part of one of the wealthiest families in the city, and here he was, a shadow of the person he used to be. Mark had been so harsh, so quick to act, without a thought for the pain the man might be carrying. He suddenly felt smaller, as if he could shrink into the ground. "I can't believe I kicked him out," Mark muttered, his voice trembling. Mark's heart pounded as he watched Mr. Reynolds's face fall further into worry. Without another word, they rushed out of the building and into the freezing night. Mark's breath came in sharp clouds as they scanned the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of Thomas. They asked a few people they passed, but no one had seen the homeless man in recent minutes. Mark felt the weight of the moment, the search for someone lost, the urgency in Mr. Reynolds's eyes. It felt like a needle was pricking at his conscience with every second that passed. "Where could he have gone?" Mr. Reynolds muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. He paced back and forth, his hands trembling. Mark felt helpless, but then a thought struck him. "Wait," Mark said, snapping his fingers. "He was shivering when I saw him earlier. It's cold. He might have gone to a shelter nearby." Mr. Reynolds looked at him, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. "That's a good idea. Let's go." They quickly drove to a well-known local shelter, a place where many homeless people sought refuge. Mark pushed open the door, and a warm gust of air greeted them. A worker behind the desk glanced up, then stopped when she saw their anxious faces. "Can I help you?" she asked. Mark explained the situation, describing Thomas as best he could. The worker nodded, her face softening. "He was here earlier, poor guy. He tried to get in, but they turned him away. They didn't believe he belonged." Mark's stomach twisted. "Where did he go after that?" The worker shrugged. "I don't know. He left quietly, just walked out." The two men exchanged a glance, and with no time to waste, they rushed back out into the night, determined to find Thomas before it was too late. Mark and Mr. Reynolds wandered the streets for what felt like hours, their hope diminishing with each passing minute. But just as they were about to give up, they turned a corner and saw him. Thomas was sitting on the cold concrete of a narrow alley, his back against the brick wall, his eyes fixed on the glowing city lights in the distance. He looked small and fragile, the light from the street lamp casting long shadows across his face. The man who had once been a part of a powerful family now seemed like a ghost of himself, lost and broken. Mr. Reynolds's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't move, unable to believe this was really happening. Finally, his legs carried him forward, his voice breaking the silence. Thomas, Thomas, is that you? The sound of his brother's name being spoken aloud seemed to snap Thomas out of his trance. He slowly turned his head, and their eyes met. There was a long pause, an almost unbearable silence. For a brief moment, Thomas said nothing, just staring at Mr. Reynolds, as if unsure whether he was really seeing his brother again. Then, his eyes filled with tears, and Mark felt his own heart tighten in his chest. Thomas's face contorted with emotion, as the dam he had built for years began to crack. Mark stood back, feeling like an intruder in this moment of raw, painful reunion. Thomas slowly stood up, his hands trembling, and Mr. Reynolds rushed toward him, his arms open. Without a word, Thomas collapsed into his brother's embrace. It was a tender, desperate hug, as though both men were trying to hold on to the fleeting moment that might slip away if they let go. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I belong in your world anymore. I don't know if I can go back." Mr. Reynolds pulled him closer, his voice soft and reassuring. "You never stopped belonging, Thomas. You're my brother, and I'll always be here for you." For the first time in years, Thomas let himself be held, the weight of his past slowly beginning to lift, as he finally allowed himself to believe in the possibility of home. As Mark stood in the background, watching the brothers reunite, a wave of guilt washed over him. He had been so quick to judge Thomas, assuming he was just another homeless man looking for trouble. But now, seeing the raw emotion between them, Mark realized how dangerous that kind of thinking was. He had allowed his assumptions to define his actions, without ever considering the pain or story behind the person standing before him. After a few moments, Mark stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, I'm sorry, I should never have treated you like that. I didn't know." Thomas turned to him, his face still soft with emotion, and a quiet smile touched his lips. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm and forgiving. "You didn't know, you were just doing your job." But the kindness in Thomas's voice hit Mark harder than any reprimand could. He nodded, a deep regret settling in his chest. He would never forget this moment, this lesson. Thomas glanced at his brother, and with a final, hesitant look at Mark, he took Mr. Reynolds' hand. "Let's go home," he said softly, the words feeling like a promise to both of them. As the two brothers walked away, Mark watched them go, feeling like a small piece of his heart had shifted. He'd learned something important tonight: never judge a person by their appearance, because there's always more to the story than meets the eye. He would never forget Thomas, or the powerful reminder of what it truly meant to be human. As the night grew colder, Mark stood alone outside the building, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't shake the image of Thomas, of the man he had so carelessly kicked out, still fresh in his mind. He had been quick to judge, to assume that Thomas was nothing more than a nuisance, just another person on the streets. But now, with the weight of his story laid bare, Mark understood how wrong he had been. He made a silent promise to himself that from now on, he would look at people with more compassion, more understanding. He would take the time to listen, and to truly see them, not just judge by their appearances. The city around him seemed different now. The cold air didn't seem so harsh, and the streets didn't feel as impersonal. As he looked at the passing faces, he felt a deeper connection to the world around him. That night, Mark realized something profound: kindness and understanding could change lives. A simple gesture, a moment of empathy, could make all the difference. And in that moment, he knew he would never look at another person the same way again. Thank you so much for watching this emotional journey with us. This story reminds us that it's easy to judge others without knowing their struggles, but a little kindness and understanding can go a long way in changing lives. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. And if you want to see more stories like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How has this story impacted you? Let's continue the conversation and spread the message of compassion. Thanks again for being part of our community. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.